Hello and hope you are all keeping well. This is the first video in the series of history videos about the crime and punishment topic. We are starting off with what punishments were used in England between the year 1000 and 1500. Before we get to looking at what punishments were actually used in this time period, we're going to think about the purpose of punishment. So why were these punishments used? And there were three different purposes of punishment: deterrent, rehabilitation and retribution. What I would like you to do now is just pause this video and see if you can match up the keyword with the definition that is on the right. So just match up the keyword with the definition and then we will go through the answers. Okay, so we are going to go through the answers now. So the first one, deterrent, matches up with a punishment that is frightening or painful and designed to put other people off committing the same crime. The next one is rehabilitation, which is to help someone return to normal life and society after they've committed a crime. And therefore the final one, retribution, must be a severe punishment that is meant to match the severity of the crime. In this time period between the years 1000 and 1500, we do not see rehabilitation as being a purpose of punishment. At this time, society hasn't got the idea that criminals can change their behaviour. They think that once a criminal, always a criminal. So therefore the punishments that we see in this time period are just deterrent and retribution. So we're going to be focused on those two purposes of punishment as we go through and look at what punishments were actually used in this time period. Because this time period is so broad, it's actually split into three distinct periods. So the first period from the year 1000 to 1066 is the Anglo-Saxon time period. So we're looking at what punishments the society had in place. Then the next time period we see is the Normans. So it occurs just after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, when the Normans arrive in England and they completely change how society is run. And then from about the middle of the 12th century up until almost 1500, you get the medieval times, or as they're sometimes referred to as the Middle Ages. So we've got three distinct time periods within this broader theme to look at to show how punishment changes in this 500-year period. The first punishment that we're going to look at is capital punishment, or as it's more commonly known as the death penalty. The main way this one was carried out was by hanging. So if you were a commoner, you'd likely be hanged, which is a very painful and slow way to go. Whereas if you were higher up in society, it's more likely that you'd be executed by having your head chopped off, because it was obviously quicker than being choked to death. These executions were done in public to serve as a reminder to everyone else of what would happen to you if you committed such a serious crime. The crimes that incurred the death penalty were treason, which is going against the king, and arson, which is setting fire to property. The reason why these two crimes were punished with the death penalty is because they were crimes that attacked the ruling classes. So if you were going against the king, you weren't just going against the person who's meant to rule over you on earth, you're also going against God's representative in England. And also, if you are burning down property, you are attacking the wealth of the people who are higher up than you in society. So these were seen as very severe crimes, and therefore the punishment matched the severity of the crime. Therefore, capital punishment is retribution and deterrent. So it's the most serious punishment in Anglo-Saxon England. And also it's done in public, as we mentioned earlier, so that everyone can see what happens when you commit a serious crime like this. Capital punishment continues pretty much across the whole time period that you look at for crime and punishment, but it does start in the Anglo-Saxon time period. Another punishment that is used in England for a long period of time is corporal punishment. So corporal punishment is a range of punishments that cause harm or pain to the body, such as eye gouging or removing a hand or foot. As you can see in the image, that man is having his fingers chopped off. It's seen as being a more lenient alternative to death. So it's for crimes that aren't as serious as treason and arson. The most common use of corporal punishment is on thieves. So if you were caught stealing something, you would have your hand chopped off. And then when you are going about your daily business in society, everyone can see that you have only got one hand and therefore know that you are a thief. So it serves as a very visual reminder to people who are considering committing that crime. So if someone was feeling quite desperate and thought they might steal some food, if they saw someone who has one hand, they might think twice about it because they want to keep both of their hands. Therefore, this punishment is a deterrent. It's designed to put other people off committing the same crime. The next punishment we have are stocks and pillory. I've got the two images on the right there. Picture A showing the stocks, which is just a man's feet being encased in wood. And the second one is the pillory, where the man's neck and hands are through a plank of wood. It combined physical pain with public humiliation. So obviously having your neck in that position in the pillory would start to really ache after a long time. These stocks and pillories were normally in the middle of town so that everyone could see them, and they're exposed to the elements. So if it's a rainy day, they're still there in the stocks or pillory having their punishment. A lot of the time people in the town would come past them and sort of shout things at them, or maybe throw rotten vegetables at them. This was a deterrent because it was humiliating to be in the middle of your town where everyone knew who you were, being publicly humiliated for committing a crime. So this was a deterrent. The final Anglo-Saxon punishment was wergild, which literally translates as man price. This punishment was given to the crime of murder, where a fine was paid to the victim's family as compensation for the murder of that person. The aim of this was to reduce blood feuds between families. So what would happen previously is, let's say someone was killed from one family, that family would then seek revenge and kill someone from the family that had murdered their person, and it would just keep escalating until basically there was a war between two families. The idea is they're trying to stop that by just saying, yes, a murder has happened, here is the money as compensation for that person's life. The fine directly correlated with the victim's status in society. So a peasant or a serf, their life was worth less, so therefore the fine you paid was lower. Whereas if you kill someone high up in society like a prince, the fine would be much higher. This punishment is an example of retribution because clearly the status of the person you killed is directly correlated in the fine you have to pay. So every man has his price, and if you are higher up in society, the price of your murder is higher. So it's also trying to put off people killing people higher up in society because they know they're going to incur a very heavy fine for that death. Okay, so now we've moved along to the Norman time period, so this is 1066 up until about 1154. This new punishment is called the murdrum fine. It replaces the Anglo-Saxon system of wergild, so it is a fine paid for the murder of someone. However, the money was paid to the government and not to the victim's family. So this is the key difference between wergild and murdrum. Wergild, the money is paid to the victim's family. Murdrum, the money is paid to the government. It is specifically for the crime of if a Norman is murdered by an Anglo-Saxon, the murderer is not captured and executed, so they don't seek to try and find out who was responsible, they just incur a fine. This was brought in because when the Normans invaded, there was a lot of hostility between the native Anglo-Saxon population and the Norman invaders. So there was a lot of crime committed by Anglo-Saxons against the Normans, and this was trying to stop that happening. It was a very large sum of money that was to be paid because the Normans were automatically higher up in society than the Anglo-Saxons were. So this fine was massive. If no one came forward to pay the fine themselves, taking responsibility for the action, the money was to be paid by the hundred where the body was found. So you get quite a funny situation where if a body turns up in your village, because you know that if no one owns up to it, you are all going to have to pay a massive fine, a lot of villagers start moving bodies into the next village. So they might try and take them over in the cover of darkness or throw them into the river so they wash further downstream away from them, because people are so scared of this punishment that they don't want to pay this massive fine, so they just want to get rid of the body at any cost. The responsibility for this murder is shared out amongst everyone in a tithing. So a tithing is a group of about 10 households who live very close to each other and have collective responsibility for the behaviour of each other. So this is the murdering fine. So it's a very serious punishment designed by the Normans to try and stop the Anglo-Saxons rising up against them, because the Normans needed to get control of England after they invaded it, and by putting this punishment in place, it was a very clear way of asserting their dominance over the Anglo-Saxons. So we have now arrived in the medieval time period. So these are the years between 1154 and about 1485 when the Tudors take over, and the final punishment is hanged, drawn and quartered. The first record of it being used in England dates to around the 13th century, and it becomes written into law in 1351 as the punishment for high treason. So high treason is plotting to kill or betray the king. This was seen as a crime against God as well as the king himself, and was the most serious crime against authority. So how the punishment works is that the person is hanged by the neck until they're almost dead, and then they are cut down. Their body is cut open and their intestines are drawn out and pulled out of their body. This is all happening whilst they are still alive. And then their head is chopped off, their body is cut into 4 quarters, and these 4 quarters are sent to different parts of the country. The reason why the 4 quarters are sent to different parts of the country is so that everyone can see what happens when you commit the most serious of crimes of going against your king. A famous victim of this punishment is William Wallace. So he tried to fight against the king to gain Scottish independence. You've also got this punishment being used on Guy Fawkes, who we'll look at as we go further through this course, who was one of the main people involved in the Gunpowder Plot to try and assassinate James I, King of England. So this punishment is retribution because it is incredibly serious, but it's also deterrent. The reason why they've made this so brutal, it's really designed to shock people. This was done in public. In the image you can see there is a crowd gathered around the man who's getting his intestines pulled out. This was seen as being very gruesome, and no one wanted to have this punishment inflicted on them, so therefore they would not commit the crime of high treason. Now that we've looked at the different punishments used between the year 1000 and 1500, I thought it'd be helpful now to look at which punishments are consistent across the 500-year period and which ones belong in specific time frames. So the first 3 ones that we looked at: capital punishment, which is the death penalty; corporal punishment, which is where your body is harmed or injured; and stocks and pillory, where you are in the middle of your town. Those 3 punishments are used consistently across the 500-year time period. The ones that are specific to different times are wergild, which is specific to the Anglo-Saxon time period, where the compensation money for a murder is paid to the victim's family to try and stop these blood feuds. The murdering fine, which is specific to the Norman time period, where the money for a murder of a Norman knight is given to the government. And finally, in the Middle Ages, hanged, drawn and quartered, that very gruesome method of execution where the 4 quarters of your body end up in different bits of the country. So here we can just see which punishments stay the same and which ones change over time. Now we are going to look to applying all that knowledge we've learnt to an exam question. This is an exam question you could get in your crime and punishment paper. It is just 4 marks, so you're not required to do loads and loads of writing. Normally 1 paragraph will be enough. In the exam you're only given lines on 1 page of A4, so that gives you an idea of how much you're expected to write for this. So we're just going to read through the question together and pick out what it's actually asking you to do. So it says, explain one way in which punishments were similar in Anglo-Saxon England and the 14th century. So we're looking for something that is the same in these 2 time periods. We've got Anglo-Saxon England, which is anything from the year 1000 to 1066, and the 14th century are the 1300s, so in the middle of this medieval time period. Remember, the century number is always 1 higher than the year it is in. For example, we are in the 21st century, but the year is 2020. So what you need to do for this question is you need to identify a similarity between the 2 time periods. You might want to look at your notes if you've been making any throughout this video, or go back through this video to see what is the same between the Anglo-Saxon times, so the first punishments we looked at, to the 14th century, which is the last time period we looked at. When you have identified this similarity, you need to give an example from each time period to demonstrate your point. So you'll say what is similar, then you'll give me an example from the Anglo-Saxon England and an example from the 14th century to show how your two things are similar. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to pause this video and have a go at it. It should only take about 5 minutes to do because we're not expecting a really long answer, so just a paragraph for this. So pause this video, give yourself 5 minutes, and then we'll go through what you found out. Okay, so I hope you've all had a go at answering that question. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at a model answer, and I'd like you to compare your answer to the model answer to see if you've got everything you would need to get 4 out of 4 on this question. So this question was asking us to explain one way in which punishments were similar in Anglo-Saxon England and the 14th century. Here is the model answer. We're just going to read it through and then we're going to pick out the different parts that would mean this would get 4 out of 4. So it says, one way punishments were similar in the Anglo-Saxon period and the 14th century was the purpose to deter people. For example, in the Anglo-Saxon period, corporal punishment was used to deter criminals from committing crimes. These would have a hand chopped off, which would serve as a reminder to the wider community about what would happen if they broke the law. This is similar to criminals being hanged, drawn and quartered in the 14th century, which was a gruesome punishment carried out in public designed to deter people from committing high treason. The quarters of their body would be sent to different parts of the country to deter people from committing the same crime. Okay, so that is our answer. You can see there that it's not very long at all. We're just going to pick out what this has done to mean it gets 4 out of 4. So the sentence I have just highlighted in red is where we've identified our similarity. The best thing to do is to do that in your first sentence. Then the examiner knows that you are answering the question. You've been asked to give one similarity, and I have given my similarity. I've said the similar thing about the Anglo-Saxon punishments and the 14th century punishments is that they are designed to deter people. So it's very clear in that first sentence what my similarity is. The parts I've highlighted in blue are me explaining how they're similar. So I haven't just said, oh yes, they're both designed to deter people and gone, for example, corporal punishment and hanged, drawn and quartered. I've explained how these two punishments deter people. So I've said corporal punishment was used to deter criminals from committing crimes because you have your hand chopped off. And I said hanged, drawn and quartering is extremely gruesome and that's how it deters people. So have a look in your answer, make sure you've identified your similarity, ideally in the first sentence, and make sure that you have explained how your two examples show that similarity. Okay, so thank you for joining us today and looking at punishments between the year 1000 and 1500. Thank you again for all your hard work and stay safe and see you in September.